Greetings, I'm Richard Wolff. Today we're not just talking headlines, we're analyzing the systems, the scandals, and the truths behind the news. Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin with a simple but unsettling truth. When power feels cornered, it often tells us more than it ever intended to. Today's headline, Trump admin makes shock admission on Elon and DOGE in blistering filing, is not just another news cycle sensation. It is a window into how political power, corporate influence, and state institutions increasingly blur into one another in modern capitalism. And if that does not make you pause, it should. What makes this admission so striking is not merely that it exists, but where it appears. It did not come from a press conference, a campaign rally, or a carefully scripted interview. It surfaced in a court filing, a space where language is constrained by evidence, risk, and legal consequence. That alone should grab our attention. Governments are often most honest when they are compelled to be, and this filing reflects exactly that moment of compulsion. After months of public assurances that strict limits were in place, that safeguards were airtight, and that no improper access or influence existed, the Trump administration effectively conceded that its earlier narrative did not fully align with reality. The shock lies in the contrast. Publicly, the administration projected confidence and control, insisting that any association between DOGE-related initiatives and figures connected to Elon Musk was either minimal or carefully managed. Privately, under judicial scrutiny, it acknowledged overlap that could not be dismissed as incidental. This is the kind of revelation that forces us to reconsider everything that came before it. If the safeguards were as solid as claimed, why was such an admission necessary at all? And if the admission is limited, what remains unsaid? Legal filings are not written to persuade voters. They are written to survive cross-examination. Every sentence is weighed against potential liability. That is why even a narrowly framed admission carries enormous weight. It suggests that the administration's previous statements were not just optimistic but strategically incomplete. The filing implicitly recognizes that access, coordination, or influence existed in forms that contradicted earlier denials. That contradiction is the real story. It exposes the fragile boundary between political messaging and legal truth. There is also a deeper hook here, one that goes beyond partisan debate. This episode demonstrates how modern governance often operates on two parallel tracks. One track is public-facing, built on slogans like efficiency, innovation, and disruption. The other track is institutional and legal, where power relationships are revealed with far less polish. When these tracks collide, as they did in this filing, the public is given a rare glimpse into how decisions are actually structured. The admission suggests that what was marketed as a clean, reform-driven initiative may have involved informal arrangements and blurred lines that only become visible when challenged in court. Perhaps most telling is what prompted the admission: pressure. It was not transparency by choice, but transparency by necessity. That distinction matters. Voluntary disclosure signals confidence and accountability. Forced disclosure signals resistance followed by retreat. In political terms, that retreat can be more damaging than the original act because it undermines trust. Once an administration concedes that its earlier assurances were incomplete, every subsequent denial invites skepticism. This is why the filing has such resonance. It is not simply about Elon Musk or DOGE as isolated subjects. It is about the reliability of official narratives in an era where private power and public authority frequently. What this episode ultimately exposes is a deeper and more troubling reality: the increasingly porous boundary between state authority and corporate power. For decades, democratic systems have relied on the assumption that government regulates markets while private actors operate within those rules. Yet the filing points to a different arrangement, one in which influence flows quietly across institutional lines, often justified by the language of efficiency and innovation. That language is seductive because it promises speed, modernization, and results. But behind it lies a fundamental question that rarely gets asked loudly enough. When government and billionaires work this closely, who is actually in charge? The hook here is subtle but powerful. This is not a story of illegal action proven beyond doubt. It is a story of proximity. And proximity itself can be transformative. When political decision makers grow accustomed to consulting, relying on, or aligning with powerful corporate figures, the nature of governance shifts. Decisions begin to reflect not only public interest, but also the priorities, timelines, and worldviews of private wealth. The filing suggests that such closeness was not accidental. It was structured, normalized, and defended until legal pressure forced a partial retreat. What makes this blurring so dangerous is that it often operates in plain sight while remaining politically invisible. Programs are branded as technical fixes rather than political choices. Efficiency becomes a shield against scrutiny. Innovation becomes an excuse for bypassing traditional oversight. In this environment, the distinction between public service and private advantage erodes quietly without a single dramatic announcement. By the time the issue reaches a courtroom, the relationships are already established, and unwinding them becomes far more difficult. There is also a psychological dimension to this convergence of power. Governments increasingly frame billionaires as problem solvers rather than stakeholders with interests of their own. This framing shifts public expectations. Instead of asking whether corporate influence should be limited, the debate becomes how quickly it can be integrated. The filing disrupts that narrative by revealing that integration comes with costs measured not only in legal risk, but in democratic credibility. When an administration must admit that boundaries were not as firm as promised, it signals that those boundaries may never have been taken seriously to begin with. Another hook worth noting is how normalized this pattern has become. What once would have triggered immediate alarm now often passes as pragmatism. The argument is familiar. Government is slow, markets are fast, and therefore collaboration is necessary. But collaboration without transparency is not collaboration. It is delegation without consent. The filing highlights how easily oversight mechanisms can be weakened when power is concentrated on both sides of the public-private divide. At its core, this is a warning about structural imbalance. When vast private wealth meets political authority, the relationship is rarely equal. The state may carry the formal power, but corporations carry leverage, resources, expertise, and influence that shape outcomes long before policies are finalized. The admission contained in the filing suggests that this leverage was not merely present, but accommodated. And once accommodation becomes routine, accountability becomes negotiable, and democratic governance begins to resemble managed partnership rather than public rule. At the heart of this controversy lies a familiar but deeply misleading promise: efficiency. Few words are as politically powerful or as strategically vague. Efficiency sounds neutral, even virtuous. Who could oppose doing more with less, saving money, cutting waste? Yet the filing forces us to interrogate what efficiency actually meant in practice, and more importantly, who defined it. The moment efficiency becomes the primary justification, democratic debate is quietly sidelined. Decisions that should be contested in public are reframed as technical necessities, shielded from scrutiny by spreadsheets and expert language. The first hook is this: efficiency is never neutral. It always reflects priorities. When an initiative is designed to streamline processes while quietly expanding access for powerful private actors, the savings are rarely shared equally. The filing suggests that while the public was assured of cost control and discipline, the underlying structure shifted risk outward. Legal exposure, institutional responsibility, and reputational damage fell squarely on public agencies, while private partners remained insulated. That is not efficiency. It is redistribution under a more respectable name. What makes this narrative so compelling is how common it has become. Governments increasingly present themselves as managers rather than representatives. In that mindset, citizens become cost centers, and democratic procedures become obstacles. The DOGE initiative was framed as a reform that would cut through bureaucracy, but the admission in the filing hints that what was really cut through were safeguards. Oversight mechanisms exist for a reason. They slow things down, they ask uncomfortable questions, and they force justification. When those mechanisms are softened in the name of efficiency, the immediate gain is speed, but the long-term cost is accountability. There is another layer to this hook that deserves attention. Efficiency narratives often rely on asymmetry of information. The public is told outcomes, not processes. Success is highlighted, trade-offs are buried. The filing disrupts that imbalance by revealing that the risks were never eliminated, only relocated. Instead of being absorbed by private entities with resources to manage them, those risks were carried by public institutions and ultimately by taxpayers. When something goes wrong, it is the government that faces lawsuits, investigations, and loss of trust, not the private actors who benefited from privileged access. This is where the story becomes less about policy and more about power. Efficiency rhetoric allows leaders to bypass political accountability by framing choices as inevitabilities. There was no alternative becomes the unspoken refrain, but the filing suggests there were alternatives, ones that would have preserved clearer boundaries and stronger oversight, and they were not chosen. That choice tells us something crucial. It reveals a preference for arrangements that favor flexibility for insiders over protection for the public. Perhaps the most unsettling hook is how persuasive this model remains even after exposure. Despite repeated examples of efficiency-driven reforms leading to concentrated benefits and socialized costs, the language survives almost untouched. The filing serves as a rare interruption in that cycle. It shows that when efficiency is treated as an end in itself, rather than a means subject to democratic limits, it becomes a tool for shifting responsibility without shifting control. And once that pattern is established, efficiency stops being a promise to the public and starts functioning as a shield for power exercised without consent. What elevates this episode beyond a single controversy is the way it illustrates a systemic pattern in contemporary politics. Truth emerging only under pressure. The admission did not arrive through proactive transparency or ethical self-correction. It surfaced because legal scrutiny left little room for ambiguity. That detail matters because it reveals how accountability increasingly operates in reverse. Instead of openness being the default, disclosure becomes the final concession, extracted rather than offered. The hook here is uncomfortable but necessary. If the courts had not intervened, the public narrative might have remained intact and unchallenged. This dynamic exposes a troubling imbalance between political messaging and institutional reality. Public statements are designed to reassure, to simplify, and to control the storyline. Legal proceedings, by contrast, demand specificity. They force officials to align words with verifiable facts. When those two worlds collide, the gap between them becomes visible. The filing demonstrates that gap with unusual clarity. It shows how official assurances can coexist with internal acknowledgments that tell a more complicated and less flattering story. That coexistence is not accidental, it is structural. There is a broader hook embedded in this pattern. Modern governance increasingly relies on the assumption that complexity itself will deter scrutiny. Legal language is dense, filings are lengthy, and few citizens have the time or resources to examine them closely. As a result, some of the most consequential truths about how power is exercised are effectively hidden in plain sight. Only when journalists, watchdogs, or litigants extract those details do they enter public consciousness. The filing in question is a reminder that democracy is often informed not by what leaders choose to highlight, but by what they are forced to admit. This has profound implications for trust. When disclosures are reactive rather than voluntary, they carry a different moral weight. They suggest not just error, but reluctance. Each forced admission invites a follow-up question: what else would we not know without pressure? That question lingers long after the immediate news cycle fades. It erodes confidence not only in the individuals involved, but in the processes meant to ensure accountability. Transparency loses its meaning if it arrives only after resistance has failed. Another critical hook lies in how normalized this process has become. Court filings, inspector reports, and investigative subpoenas are now routine sources of political revelation. This normalization shifts expectations. Citizens come to assume that official statements are provisional, while legal documents are closer to the truth. That inversion is dangerous. A healthy democracy depends on credibility at the highest levels of public communication. When credibility migrates from elected leadership to legal compulsion, governance begins to resemble damage control rather than representation. The filing also highlights a structural asymmetry in consequences. Institutions can absorb reputational harm, issue clarifications, and move on. The public, however, bears the long-term cost of diminished trust and weakened norms. Each episode of forced disclosure lowers the threshold for the next one. Over time, this creates a political culture where accountability is episodic instead of continuous, activated only when someone applies sufficient pressure. What makes this moment significant is not just what was admitted, but how it was admitted. It underscores a system in which oversight is reactive, transparency is conditional, and truth is often treated as a liability rather than a responsibility. That realization should not be dismissed as cynical. It should be understood as a call to recognize how power actually functions, not in speeches, but in the fine print where resistance finally gives way to disclosures. So what do we do with this shock admission? We do not dismiss it as partisan noise, and we do not reduce it to personalities. Instead, we treat it as a warning. Democracy cannot survive on press releases alone. It requires transparency that is enforced, not volunteered. It requires skepticism toward power, especially when power smiles and calls itself innovation.